Okay, so at this point, we have information on all 21 fragments. A couple weeks ago, we got information on 12 of the prismatic fragments. Well, now we've got all 21, thanks to a bunch of content creators being invited out to Bungie headquarters to test play the final shape and the prismatic subclass. So in this screen right here, you're looking at the 21 fragments. I was able to pull together these images from other people's footage. So that's all 21 of them there. And I'm going to be discussing what I think are essentially the top 3 and then the top 5 and additionally maybe top 6, because I've seen that there are some subclasses, I guess depending on the aspects and whether you're Titan, Warlock, or Hunter, I don't know, you'll have access to 6 fragments on a given build. Up to 6 fragments, right? Some will be 5, I think, some will be 6. Currently, the maximum amount of fragments that we can have on any of our light and dark core builds or subclasses is 5 fragments, right? So, we'll have access to a little bit more build crafting. Essentially, the more fragments that we can use, the more dynamic we can make our builds and customizable. So that's kind of neat. Originally, I was just going to do what I think are the top 5, but in studying the information that we have on these fragments, I was able to essentially deduce that there's going to be 3 fragments that, regardless of the seasonal artifact, they're going to play a key part in almost every single prismatic build, and then there's going to be an additional 3 fragments that I think are going to be basically secondary and extremely common in almost every prismatic build, right? They're going to be more easily interchangeable with other fragments and exotics and aspects and whatever we can use to make up for the lack of certain fragments. But yeah, just generally speaking, there's about 6 essential fragments in my opinion, and I'm not going to be discussing in depth the other 15 fragments because it's going to be information overload. Right now, if you're looking at these images of these fragments, it probably means absolutely nothing to you, right? So let's go into CourtProjects. Shout out to CourtProject and the PvE breakdown podcast. I listen to those guys there, and these infographics are absolutely awesome. So I'll go over there and we'll discuss the most important fragments in order and how I kind of came to this theory. Alright, so this is the infographics from CourtProjects on the 21 fragments. Obviously, the icons don't match up with the actual in-game icons because I think this was basically produced before we had all of the footage with the actual icons, but basically the verbiage in here and the descriptions are all legit. So this is what I did with this infographic. I first circled all the fragments that I thought were the most interesting to me, that would be endgame PvE viable for Master Raids and Dungeons and Grandmasters, solo Legend campaign, solo play in general. And then I circled 3 of those white circled fragments with an additional yellow circle, because these are fragments that I see as basically never coming off. They're going to be essential to basically every prismatic build, and you're going to be hard pressed to find ways to replace them. Then I circled made a couple of red circles on fragments that I thought would also complement those 3 essentials, with a little bit of gameplay loop involved, but they're going to be very strong and they're basically going to be beneficial on any build, at least as far as I can see so far. And then not to be too exclusive to Transcendence, because the only things that I left out here are basically fragments that boost your Transcendence energy or regeneration, which is not something that I see as necessary to do for build crafting, much in the way that we don't really need to build into super energy for most endgame PvE builds, because your neutral gameplay is going to be the most important thing in PvE anyways, because you need to rely on your neutral game at all times, and that neutral game needs to encompass survivability, it needs to encompass the maximum amount of weapon damage, the maximum amount of ability damage, and that's basically it, right? If you can encompass all those things, then you're going to be hard pressed to take those fragments off, because then the whole subclass in general is just going to feel weaker, right? But I do understand at the same point that even though Transcendence is not a super, it's just kind of a mini super, and so you will have access to it more often than a super, so it could be more relevant in the Prismatic subclass, and I understand it is strong. So, but more importantly, these green circles here are fragments that are that actually make your Transcendence stronger in some way, depending on how you're building into your build overall and Transcendence, right? Depending on the buffs that you're using, your abilities and stuff like that. So while you're Transcendent, you can actually reap some extra benefits as opposed to just being Transcendent without these fragments. But I'm not going to be discussing those really. I'm just going to be discussing the 3 yellow circled fragments and the red circled fragments, so I'll go into that next. So Facet of Purpose, this is the first fragment that I do not see coming off of anybody's builds on Prismatic pretty much ever, right, unless we have access to multiple elemental buffs through other exotics and other means. But just generally speaking, being able to get pick up an orb of power, like as you currently would if you're using Echo of Starvation on Void, which most people are. You pick up an orb, you get Devour. On Strand, you pick up an orb, you get Woven Mail, right? These are like essential fragments on those subclasses for a reason. It's just that easy. You pick up an orb, you get a buff. The buff is kind of like the foundation of your build. It's either going to keep you alive, it's going to give you mobility, it's going to give you damage, etc., right? So Facet of Purpose, it's going to be an absolutely top tier essential fragment, and even so on easier content, right? Like if you just want to do patrols or normal campaign missions or hero difficulty stuff, like Facet of Purpose is still going to be a very valuable fragment to use there, just to have fun with your build, right? Benefit from those buffs. So you'll be able to get like Frost Armor, Woven Mail, Overshields, Restoration, and Amplified just from this one fragment, right? Depending on what super you're using. So that's the first fragment. And the second most important fragment, Facet of Protection. Gain increased damage resistance while surrounded by enemy combatants. While Transcendent, damage resistance is enhanced. So, I mean, the main idea here is this is like Spark of Resistance for Arc, which is a staple fragment on Arc, just like Spark of Shock, you know, like adding Jolt to your grenades. It's just one of those fragments that basically never comes off of the Arc subclass, doesn't matter what build you're using. Same thing for Spark of Resistance. It's 25% damage resistance when you're within like 30 feet of one enemy or 2 enemies, something like that. Maybe 3. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but still, Facet of Protection is basically going to give you a very similar damage resistance to Spark of Resistance. So, I mean, anything that has a high tier of DR, like, yeah, it's going to be hard to replace that in endgame PvE, so I do not foresee this coming off very easily. So third, we've got Facet of Dawn. This is basically Ember of Torches from Solar. You get Radiant when you apply melee hits, right? And it says powered melee hits. Okay, so fair. Powered melee kills give your allies Radiant. Either way, this is going to be a staple fragment because 25% extra weapon damage is basically, you can't match it. You can stack it with surges. That's just something that you can't go without if you want to, you know, be done with a dungeon or a raid fast. If you want to farm an activity, Radiant takes you a long ways. It also takes care of anti-barrier champions. And being able to have anti-barrier rounds on any weapon for any purpose, like even outside of anti-barrier champions, is very good. You can pierce Scorn Raiders' shields, phalanxes, like any shielded enemies in the game. Being a Radiant is just a huge benefit, right? You don't have to sit there and do no damage to an enemy because they're holding a shield up. You're literally just shooting through their shield because you're Radiant. So this is going to be one of those fragments that's just going to be extremely hard to take off unless you can replace it through some other means, like Acrobat's Dodge on Hunter, or Warlocks have an exotic that I'm blanking on the name right now that they can get Radiant with their fusion rifles. Also, one thing to consider here is that even though I'm saying how important this is now, keep in mind we're getting a seasonal artifact where if you pick up an Orb of Power, you will become Radiant. So this first season or first episode will be pretty much the only time where you're going to see Facet of Dawn being more of a trivial aspect on Prismatic. But if you look outside of the artifact in general, like this is definitely going to be a long-term staple fragment on all Prismatic subclasses, right? And even so, even if you can't pick up an Orb of Power, like if you're going into a boss, like a boss damage phase, and there's no orbs on the ground, especially if you're like solo, well, then you need to rely on your melee because there's no orb to pick up to get Radiant. So this is still going to be essential fragment, even with the first episode and the seasonal artifact. Alright, so now on to the next 3 fragments, which I think are still going to be fairly essential to most Prismatic builds, but they're not quite as important as the first 3 that we went over. But this first one is going to be Facet of Courage, and this is just another damage bonus that like you just can't pass up damage bonuses like this that subclasses offer, like passing up Weaken on Void, passing up Radiant on Solar. Like it's just not a good idea to do that in endgame PvE. Like you're basically handicapping yourself by not taking advantage of the best parts of any build, right? So Facet of Courage, and the only reason that I'm a little bit on the fence with this one being like as essential as the first 3 is because I don't know what the numbers are, right? So but basically what this does, what it says it does is light abilities deal increased damage to targets affected by darkness debuffs. And this is going to be very easy to do with the next 2 fragments that I'm going to discuss, which are basically going to play into this gameplay loop with Facet of Courage. However, if you're doing boss damage or you just even ad clear and endgame content, and you're using like a pulse grenade, say I'm just thinking out loud from the perspective of a Titan that has access to frenzied blades and pulse grenades, right? Pulse grenades are arguably the best arc grenades, one of the best damage grenades in the game, or vortex grenades on Warlock, but either way, say I'm using frenzied blades, then I can apply Sever. The enemy is now has a darkness debuff. That means my pulse grenade is going to do more damage, right? So same thing goes if I'm on Warlock. I hit him with an arcane needle. Now the target is unraveled, affected by a darkness debuff, and then my vortex grenade is going to be doing more damage. So if you can build into an ability spam build and do a massive amount of damage like that, that's going to be hard to pass up. Think back to Season of the Plunder when Touch of Thunder storm grenades were meta with Heart of Inmost Light on Titan. Like you can literally just not even use weapons ever, even on bosses, Grandmasters, dungeons, raids. Currently, like it's almost the same thing with grapple melee, right? 1-2 punch grapple melee, it's infinite. Like you don't even need weapons. So this could potentially be an extremely good fragment. It just depends on how much of a buff it actually is. Like if your pulse grenade is only going to do like 5% extra, 5% more damage, maybe it's a little bit more trivial. But if it's like 20% more damage, that could be very hard to pass up, especially if you can spam those abilities. And so the next fragment, Facet of Dominance, as I was saying, if you're going to make your arc grenade better already through Facet of Courage, and even if you're not making it better through Facet of Courage, well, you can just make it better through Facet of Dominance, which stacks with Facet of Courage, right? So applying Jolt to your arc grenades, very good idea. More ad clear, more damage over time. Void grenades apply Weaken. Being able to apply a 15% debuff to an enemy that increases the damage that they receive from anybody, like your allies, just anything, 15% more damage. So you just can't go wrong with this fragment, just generally speaking. Think of Echo of Undermining on Void, think of Spark of Shock on Arc. They're hardly ever fragments that we take off of our builds on those subclasses. So Facet of Dominance is likely going to be a very dominant fragment. And that's probably why it's got a -10 discipline stat, and that's going to be irrelevant because it's just going to be that good. And the 6th and final fragment that I'm going to be discussing here that I see as basically an essential to Prismatic is Facet of Solitude, and I was debating with myself on whether this would take precedence over Facet of Dominance, the one we just talked about. I think it's a little bit more subjective for me because I'm already a huge fan of Threat of Isolation on Strand, right? So what Facet of Solitude does, rapid precision hits emit a Severing Burst from the target. Severing Burst is a darkness debuff that's going to play into Facet of Courage to give your light abilities more damage. But it's also going to give you an extra 40% damage resistance from the targets that you're severing, right? That's a big deal, especially if you're soloing dungeon bosses or whatever. If you can make the most threatening target in the game or in the encounter do 40% less damage to you, then your odds of surviving are just that much greater. But the fact that this can so easily proc and play into Facet of Courage and then Facet of Dominance, right? It just works hand in hand with those two fragments, and all you got to do is land rapid precision hits, right? You can do it with any weapon, as long as you can hit those precision hits. You're going to sever, and you're just gonna amplify your other fragments because of that. You're just going to play into the loop, right? So there's my take on the 6 most essential fragments for Prismatic, regardless of artifact, regardless of exotics, regardless of class or aspects or abilities in general, right? Those are going to be the 6 most important fragments to me. And basically what I'm going to be looking for in my builds is ways to do away with those fragments so that I can actually be more creative with my builds, right? So I'm going to look at all the other options that I have, like how can I replace Radiant? Like I said, with the seasonal artifact, we're going to have the opportunity to use a different fragment other than Facet of Dawn, potentially, as long as we're picking up Orbs of Power, right? So that's going to be an interesting way to build craft with Prismatic, is finding ways to get the best benefits of Prismatic without having to use the fragments that give you those benefits, right? So that's just kind of my take on build crafting in general. Again, taking a look at these icons are very gorgeous. If you don't know what a faucet is, it's basically like the angularity of a cut gemstone. I'm a huge stone nerd. I'm actually a stonemason and a rock hounding hobbyist that has way too many stones at home. So yeah, pretty cool. And so again, here in yellow, you're going to see the top 3 fragments: Facet of Purpose, Facet of Protection, and Facet of Dawn, followed by the next 3 most essential fragments that have a lot of gameplay loop synergy, which is going to be Facet of Courage, Facet of Dominance, and Facet of Solitude. So there you have it. You'll have to let me know in the comments what you think of these prismatic fragments. Which ones are you looking forward to the most? What do you think is going to be glued to your side at all times? For me, these 6 are basically on my radar, and I've already got builds in mind for them, but that's discussion for another video. Might be in the final shape, we'll have to see. So take care. We'll see you in the next one.